It was a warm evening, but the air felt heavy. A storm was coming, not in the sky but in the streets, in the hearts of those who had been pushed too far for too long. The city buzzed with life, cars honked, children laughed in the distance, and streetlights flickered as night crept in. But for one mother, none of it mattered. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone, her hands trembling as she read the message again. Her son had been stopped by the police. Again. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't the first time, but something about this felt different. The officer's tone when she called for answers was cold, dismissive. Her son wasn't a troublemaker. He was a good kid, respectful, smart. She had taught him how to survive in this world, how to keep his hands visible, how to speak carefully, how to not make sudden moves. And yet, here they were. She grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. Her mind raced as she drove, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The streets blurred past her, but all she could think about was her son, alone, scared, and at the mercy of a system that had never been kind to people like them. When she arrived at the station, she could feel the stares. The tired, uninterested glances of the officers behind the desk, the silent judgment in their eyes. She didn't care. She walked up, her voice steady but firm. She wanted to see her son. Now. The officer barely looked up. He's being processed. Her stomach twisted. Processed? For what? She demanded answers, but all she got were vague statements, half-truths. He fit a description. There was an incident. They were just following procedure. She wanted to scream, but she knew that anger wouldn't help. It never did. Minutes stretched into an hour. She called everyone she could think of, friends, community leaders, a lawyer. Someone had to help. Finally, they let her see him. He sat in a small, cold room, his hands in his lap, his face blank. But she knew that look. He was trying to be strong. Trying not to cry. She knelt in front of him, brushing his hair back. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." He nodded, but his eyes stayed down. "I didn't do anything." She believed him. She always would. When she turned back to the officer standing by the door, her voice was calm but unshakable. "We're not leaving until you tell me exactly what's going on." The officer sighed, flipping through a file. There was a robbery. A suspect ran. Your son happened to be in the area. That was it. That was all they had. Her fists clenched. How many times had she heard the same excuse? How many times had they taken a boy who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? She wouldn't let this go. Not this time. She stood up, her voice steady. "I want a lawyer. Now." The officer hesitated, then nodded. As she sat beside her son, she squeezed his hand. He was tired. So was she. But she wasn't backing down. This was just the beginning. The hours dragged on inside that small, suffocating room. The harsh fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shadows on the walls. She kept her grip firm on her son's hand, feeling the slight tremble in his fingers. He was trying to be strong, but she could see through it. She always could. A lawyer finally arrived, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a sharp mind. He sat down across from them, flipping open a notepad. "I need you to tell me everything," he said, voice calm but urgent. Her son hesitated. His shoulders tensed. She squeezed his hand, silently telling him it was okay to speak. "I was walking home," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I stopped at the corner store for a drink. When I walked out, I saw some guys running down the street. Then, a cop car pulled up, and," he swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the officer standing outside the room. "They told me to stop. I didn't even run. I froze." She closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her lips together. She had warned him about this, about how quickly things could go wrong. And still, it happened. The lawyer nodded, writing everything down. "Did they tell you why they stopped you?" "They just said I fit the description," he muttered. She let out a slow breath, trying to control the anger bubbling in her chest. How many times had those words been used as an excuse? Fit the description. What did that even mean? The lawyer looked at her. "They're holding him on suspicion, but they don't have real evidence. If they did, he wouldn't be sitting in this room. They'd be processing charges." She tightened her grip on her son's hand. "Then why are we still here?" He sighed. "Because they want to scare him." The words sat heavy between them. She had seen it before, heard the stories from neighbors, from friends. It wasn't just about one night, it was about sending a message. She turned toward the officer standing by the door. "We're leaving," she said, her voice steady. "Unless you're charging him with something, we're done here." The officer didn't move. "We're still waiting on a positive ID from the store owner." She clenched her jaw. "So, you don't even know if you have the right person?" Silence. The lawyer stood up. "Unless you charge him, we have no reason to stay. You're holding a minor without cause." The officer shifted uncomfortably, then turned to leave the room. She exhaled, her hand still gripping her son's. He was safe, for now. But this wasn't over. When they finally walked out of the station, the air outside felt heavy, thick with tension. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk. She wrapped an arm around her son, pulling him close. "We're going home," she whispered. "But we're not letting this go." He didn't answer, just leaned into her warmth as they walked toward the car. She had fought battles before, but this one, it felt different. Bigger. And she wasn't backing down. Not this time. The drive home was silent. Her son stared out the window, lost in thought. She could see the way his fingers tapped against his knee, a nervous habit from when he was little. She wanted to say something, to tell him everything would be okay. But she didn't want to lie. When they pulled into the driveway, she turned to him. "You don't have to talk, but if you need to." "I'm fine," he muttered, unbuckling his seatbelt. She watched him disappear inside, the weight of the night pressing against her chest. She wasn't fine. He wasn't fine. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She knew this wasn't just about her son. This was about all the mothers before her who had fought, who had cried, who had demanded justice and been ignored. She wouldn't be ignored. She stayed up late that night, scrolling through her phone, reading story after story of families who had been through the same nightmare. The system was broken, and she wasn't going to just accept it. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, she started typing. A post. A story. A call for help. She wasn't alone. And soon, neither was her son. The next morning, her phone was flooded with messages. People in the community, friends, even strangers, all reaching out. Some with support, others with their own stories. She read each one carefully, her heart breaking with every message. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And she was done being silent. She called a friend, someone who had experience organizing protests, someone who knew how to make noise the right way. "We need to do something," she said, her voice firm. The response was immediate. "We will." And just like that, a fire was lit. Word spread quickly. What happened to her son wasn't just her fight, it was everyone's fight. Parents, teachers, activists, all coming together, all demanding the same thing, justice. As the sun set, she stood in her living room, watching the news play on the screen. Another name. Another story. Another family in pain. Her hands curled into fists. They wanted her to be quiet. To forget. To move on. But she wasn't going anywhere. She turned to her son, who stood in the doorway, watching her. "Are we really doing this?" he asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. She nodded. "We are. For him. For every child like him." The fight was just beginning. The days that followed felt like a blur. The story had spread faster than she expected, reaching people beyond their neighborhood, beyond the city. Strangers sent messages of support, while others questioned, doubted, tried to dismiss her son's experience as just another mistake. But she knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It never was. She stood in front of the mirror, her phone buzzing with notifications. A local news station had reached out, asking for an interview. She hesitated. Speaking out meant putting herself and her son in the spotlight, making them a target. But staying silent meant accepting what had happened. And she couldn't do that. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. When she arrived at the station, the bright lights and cameras made her heart pound, but she kept her back straight, her hands steady. The reporter, a woman with kind eyes, started with the usual questions: what happened, how her son was treated, what she wanted to see change. Her voice was calm but firm. "I want accountability. I want to know why my son was treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." The interview aired that night, and the reaction was immediate. Some people stood with her, demanding justice, while others defended the officers, saying they were just doing their jobs. The divide was clear, but she didn't care about the arguments. She cared about her son, about every child who had to walk through this world carrying fear on their shoulders. The next day, a protest was planned. She didn't know how many people would show up, but as she walked to the meeting spot, she saw them, hundreds of them. Parents, students, neighbors, all holding signs, all standing together. Her heart swelled with emotion. Her son stood beside her, his fingers gripping a sign. He hadn't said much since that night, but now, standing here, he looked stronger. She reached for his hand, squeezing it. The march started slow, voices rising in unison, feet moving together. The city watched as they made their way through the streets, demanding answers, demanding change. Then, she saw them. Officers lined up ahead, watching, waiting. Her breath caught for a moment, but she kept walking. This was their right. They weren't backing down. The crowd grew louder, voices filled with pain, with determination. She looked at her son, saw the way he stood taller, the way he finally looked like he belonged in this fight. Then, something shifted. A tension in the air. The officers started moving, speaking into radios, watching the crowd closely. Her heart pounded. And then, she felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the way the energy of the crowd tensed, like a held breath waiting to be released. The line of officers ahead remained still, their eyes locked on the growing sea of voices pushing forward. She squeezed her son's hand, her pulse quickening. This was supposed to be peaceful. A march for justice, not a confrontation. Then, a voice cut through the crowd. A man, standing just a few steps ahead of her, was shouting. His words were sharp, angry. She didn't recognize him, but his presence felt wrong, like he wasn't there for the same reason they were. He wasn't marching, he was pushing. Instigating. The officers reacted immediately, adjusting their stances, speaking into radios. She turned to the man, raising a hand as if she could stop whatever was about to happen. "Please," she called out, her voice firm but pleading. "We're here for justice, not trouble." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, scanning the crowd like he was looking for a fight. A deep, sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Someone had sent him. The noise around them swelled, people reacting to his outburst, trying to pull him back, trying to reason. Her son tugged at her arm, his voice barely audible over the shouting. "Mom, we should move." But she couldn't. Not yet. Because in that moment, she saw something worse. A man on the far side of the street, dressed too clean, too careful, watching. He wasn't a protester, and he wasn't a bystander. He was there for a reason. And then, just for a second, his eyes met hers. And he smirked. Her breath hitched. This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted this protest to go wrong. Someone wanted her to fail. She grabbed her son's hand and started moving. "Stay close," she whispered. The shouting grew louder. The officers were closing in. The man in the crowd was getting more aggressive, pushing against people, riling them up. It was working. The energy of the protest was shifting, twisting into something it was never meant to be. She spotted familiar faces in the crowd, the people who had stood beside her from the beginning. "Get the kids out," she said quickly. "Make sure they're safe." Her friend nodded, eyes wide with worry, and started pulling the younger marchers toward the sidewalks. She turned back toward the officers. Some looked hesitant, uncertain. Others looked ready. Waiting for an excuse. The man ahead shoved someone. A reaction. A moment of chaos. And then, her worst fear. A loud, sharp sound cut through the air. Her son flinched, eyes wide with fear. Everything was about to change. The sharp sound rang through the air, freezing everything for a split second. The crowd went silent, people ducking instinctively, eyes darting in panic. Her son clutched her arm, his breath quick and shallow. She turned, scanning the sea of faces, trying to understand what had happened. Then came the shouting. A ripple of movement, people pushing back, fear spreading like wildfire. Someone screamed. A group of protesters stumbled away from the center, eyes wide, pointing. She couldn't see the source of the sound, but she knew what it meant. Someone wanted to create chaos. Someone wanted this to spiral out of control. She grabbed her son's hand, pulling him toward the sidewalk. "Stay with me," she said, her voice low but firm. The officers had moved now, stepping forward, hands gripping their equipment. The man who had been causing trouble in the crowd was gone, disappeared the moment everything turned chaotic. But the man across the street, the one who had smirked at her, he was still there. Watching. Her stomach turned. Then, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out, loud and commanding. One of the protesters, a woman she recognized from community meetings, climbed onto a nearby bench and raised her hands. "Stay calm," she shouted. "Do not run. Do not give them what they want." People hesitated. The tension didn't disappear, but it wavered. The officers stopped advancing, watching. Some looked uncertain now, as if realizing they had been pulled into something beyond their control. She turned to her son, seeing the fear in his eyes, and something inside her hardened. She wasn't going to let this end in disaster. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "We are here for justice," she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We will not be silenced." More voices joined in. The crowd, instead of dispersing in panic, held firm. The fear didn't vanish, but the control, the power, shifted. The man across the street narrowed his eyes. He had expected chaos. He had expected fear. He had expected failure. But he hadn't expected them to stand their ground. Then, he moved. He turned sharply and disappeared into the alleyway, gone in an instant. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. The officers didn't move any closer. The protesters held their ground. And slowly, the tension began to ease. It wasn't over. She knew that. There were still battles ahead, still fights to be won. But tonight, they hadn't let fear win. Her son looked up at her, eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in days. Not just relief. Not just exhaustion. Hope. And in that moment, she knew, they weren't done fighting. But they weren't alone. The night air felt heavier than before, thick with everything that had just happened. She could still hear the echoes of voices, still feel the tension in her chest. But for the first time in days, she also felt something else, strength. People lingered after the protest, talking in small groups, their voices hushed but determined. They knew this wasn't the end. It was just one step. But it was a step forward, and that meant everything. She squeezed her son's hand, and he looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He had seen too much, carried too much, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A spark. As they walked home, the streets felt different. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because she had changed. Fear hadn't won. Silence hadn't won. They had stood their ground, and now, people were watching. Listening. The next morning, the news was everywhere. Images from the protest, the way the crowd had refused to break, the way they had taken back control. Some reports tried to twist the story, paint it as reckless, dangerous. But others, more than she expected, told the truth. They showed the people who had come together, the families who had marched, the voices that had demanded justice without fear. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from friends, from strangers, from reporters wanting to hear more. But the one that made her pause was from a number she didn't recognize. The message was short. I saw what they tried to do. I have proof. Meet me, ***. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Proof. Of what? And from who? She hesitated before replying. Where? A few minutes later, a location popped up. It wasn't far. She turned to her son, who was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched breakfast. He looked up when he felt her gaze. What is it? He asked. She debated telling him. But he had been part of this from the start. He had the right to know. Someone wants to meet. They say they have proof. He sat up straighter. Proof of what? I don't know. She took a breath. But I'm going to find out. Later that day, she arrived at the location, a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. A man was waiting inside, sitting near the window, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. She approached cautiously, sitting across from him. He didn't look up right away. You don't know me, he said finally, his voice low. But I was there last night. And I know what they tried to do. Her stomach tightened. Who? He slid a small flash drive across the table. You'll want to see this for yourself. She hesitated before picking it up. What's on it? Proof that someone planned to turn that protest into something violent. You were set up. Her pulse quickened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. Who? She asked again. He shook his head. I can't say. Not yet. But if you want to fight this, you'll need that. He gestured to the flash drive. And you'll need to be careful. She studied him for a long moment. There was something about him, nervous, but not dishonest. He was risking something by being here. Why are you helping me? She asked. He exhaled, looking out the window. Because I've seen this happen before. And I've stayed quiet too many times. He turned back to her. Don't let them get away with it. She nodded, gripping the flash drive tightly. I won't. That night, she plugged it into her laptop, her son watching beside her. The screen filled with video clips, documents, conversations she wasn't supposed to see. Plans. Orders. Proof that someone had planted agitators in the crowd, hoping to turn a peaceful protest into something they could use as an excuse to shut it down. Her son leaned forward, eyes wide. "Mom, this is big." She swallowed hard. "I know." She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The weight of what she had in her hands was too heavy. But she knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, she made a decision. She reached out to the same reporter who had interviewed her before. Sent them the files. By the afternoon, the story was out. And this time, the world was listening. The backlash was immediate. Officials scrambling, people demanding answers. The truth was out now, and there was no burying it. But with it came new risks, calls warning her to stay quiet, people trying to discredit her. But she refused to be silenced. Her son stood by her side through it all, watching as she fought, as she refused to back down. And in the end, when the truth finally forced change, when those responsible were held accountable, he looked at her with something deeper than admiration. Pride. And she knew then that everything they had endured, every moment of fear and doubt, had led to something bigger. They had made a difference. As they walked home one evening, the city felt different again. Not because the fight was over, there was always more to do. But because now, they weren't fighting alone. And that was enough to keep going.